All right, so I'm trying a different approach to doing these online live lectures um, because most students are choosing not to participate live. So instead of using Elluminate, I'm going to try and post these to YouTube. We'll see how this works. So today's topic is language and intelligence. When we talk about language, language are just symbols that we give to spoken language. Um, they're how we combine. How we combine symbols to communicate meaning, and these can be spoken, written, or gestured. Um, Language involves rules for combining those symbols. And like I said before, symbols can be sort of these written language, but can also be auditory symbols as well. One interesting thing about language is that language acquisition uh, occurs relatively effortlessly for children by the age of 3. And there are stages of language acquisition that happen very early in a child's development. So this very early in a child's development, we have the babbling stage. This is where infants are saying, they're babbling out sounds that at first may be unrelated to like the household language, whatever language you speak in your house. Interestingly, deaf babies, so children who are born deaf, will babble with their hands if they observe their parents, for example, using sign language. So deaf babies will babble, make language with their hands if they are born to deaf parents. At about 4 months old, infants can make distinctions between the different sounds of language. So, for example, they prefer to look at faces that are consistent with the sound that they hear. The ah sound, when we make the ah sound, it's associated with an open mouth, ah, lowered jaw. When we make the e sound, this is associated with a sort of a pulling back of the cheeks, sort of e, and sort of a tightened, sort of clenched jaw. And what we find is that when you play these ah and e sounds and you show infants pictures of faces, the baby tends to look towards the face that is consistent with the sound that it hears. So if it hears an ah, it'll look at the ah face or the open mouth. If it hears the e sound, it's going to look towards the e face. Okay. Now, before the end of the first year, we have developed and sort of tuned into all the sounds of our native language, whatever that native language happens to be. One of the interesting things about language acquisition is this idea that that babies are specially prepared to discriminate all of the different kinds of sounds of human language. So babies are able to learn. If you take a baby and you put them in any household that speaks any language, that baby will learn that language of that household, regardless of who their parents are. There's some evidence that suggests that one of the reasons that it becomes more difficult for people to learn language as they get older is that we lose the ability to discriminate between sounds that don't occur in our language. So if you click on this link here and you watch this brief video, they will demonstrate this aspect of language and sound recognition. So if you watch that video, what you saw was that the baby was able to use that information about the different sounds to predict when that flashing toy was going to light up, essentially providing evidence that shows that the babies are able to discriminate between these different sounds of human language at a very young age. Now, what's interesting about this is that children, they can use this same methodology to demonstrate when children lose the ability to discriminate between non-native sounds. So there are sounds in languages, there are sounds in English, for example, that other languages don't have that sound. They don't use those sounds. They don't make distinctions between those sounds. And as you grow older, as the babies grow older, at about 1 year old, they lose the ability. They lose the ability to discriminate between those different sounds. So, for example, in Japan, Japanese the Japanese language does not discriminate between the L and the R sound. In English, we make a hard distinction between those two sounds, but in Japan, their L and their R sound is sort of a combined, blended sound. There's not a real distinction. So to a native Japanese speaker, the two English words directly and directory sound very similar, and the reason that they sound very similar is they no longer have the ability to discriminate between that L and R sound. Right? It takes a lot of training for them to develop that ability. Whereas children, they pick up on this relatively effortlessly through their listening to what we are saying and what the grown-ups in their life are saying. Right? And so they know that the difference between ah and e matters. But they also know that, for example, different pitches of ah don't matter, that that's essentially the same sound of language. And this is all evidence towards this idea that children are born with a special predisposition to learn language. Now, at 1 year, as I said, they lose their ability to discriminate between non-native language sounds. And around this 1 year old, the kids start speaking in one word, speaking in one word sentences. They're not really sentences if they're one word, but they start speaking using single words. We often talk about this as sort of word plus point communication. You can imagine the baby says milk and then points at the milk. So around 1 year, mostly speaking in single words. If you watch this video, Infant Speech Sound Discrimination, you can see that the kids no longer are able to make the distinction between those non-native sounds. So by about 2 years old, children develop into the two-word stage, where speech development, they're speaking mostly two-word statements. Oftentimes we call this telegraphic speech because the child speaks sort of like a text message without a lot of flourish and without a lot of additional information. Mostly, sort of noun-verb combinations. Read book, no milk, right? Want juice, right? And these are sort of telegraphic-like utterances. And this is the baby sort of developing this language further, but not able to sort of include these sort of auxiliary or sort of the additional necessary words. Interestingly, too, around 2 years old, they start to follow these rules of syntax, so putting adjectives before nouns and those sorts of things. Now, after the second year, children rapidly add more words and they apply grammar. Now, what's interesting about this idea is that culture plays a role in language development. Culture plays a role in language development. So there's an interesting application of this idea that children acquire and apply grammar. So in the 1900s, Hawaiian plantation owners were using slaves to work their fields, and they would bring slaves from all over the country, all over the world, and all of these different cultures, they spoke different languages, and so they had to communicate with each other, and they developed a pidgin language, and this pidgin language started out as sort of a rudimentary form of language, but over time it developed a grammar and a syntax, and this grammar and syntax was applied by the children of these slaves, right? So they started with their native language, but then the children grew up speaking this pidgin language, and the language evolved from there. And so this is more evidence that children are especially predisposed to applying rules of grammar. By 5 years old, most kids have mastered grammar of their native language, and this is faster than most of us could learn a language as an adults. If you or I tried to learn Japanese or French or some other language, we find it exceedingly difficult. But if you took a baby and you raised them in a bilingual household where they spoke both Spanish and English, that baby would learn both of those languages relatively effortlessly. And so this is part of this evidence that we're predisposed to learn language, but also part of this evidence that learning language is part of our genetic endowment. Hypothetically, and we obviously would never do this study, but hypothetically, if a group of children were raised apart from adults, so you imagine you take these 20 kids and you put them on an island somewhere where they have enough food and they're able to survive, over time, they would develop their own rudimentary form of language. And over successive generations, that language would become increasingly complex. Right? Of course, we would never do that. There is some evidence for this, though, out of Nicaragua. So Nicaragua was a country that had very poor social structures, very poor government systems, and many people lived in sort of isolated villages, in the rainforest and all over the country. And deaf children who were born deaf, really didn't have any resources that were available to them. Now, over time, there was sort of a coup, and the new government decided that they were going to try and help, help the citizens and increase social services. And one of the things that they created was this Nicaraguan School for the Deaf. This is a link here if you're interested to more information about this. And what they did was they brought isolated deaf children, so children who are growing up in isolation, together to one center to help them, essentially, to educate them. And what they found was that over time, these kids who were born deaf developed their own version of sign language. Right. So the youngest, the first generation of these kids developed sort of their own rudimentary sign language based on their experiences of trying to communicate in the past. And then what happened was the older children taught it to the younger children who were brought, continuously brought to this school. And the younger children added grammatical complexity, refined the physical motions of the sign language, and also added grammar. And eventually, it developed into its own fully formed language called Nicaraguan Sign Language. So what this is evidence is that this sort of natural predisposition to learn language, plus this sort of shared absence of language, will lead to the development of a new and increasingly complex language. Now, so we know kids do this, right? But the question is how. There's sort of a long-standing argument between B.F. Skinner, if you recall B.F. Skinner, sort of the behaviorist guy, all about operant conditioning. Skinner thought that language acquisition was largely due to rewards. So children are being rewarded for speaking and punished mildly through correction. And so he argued that all language was essentially the result of operant conditioning. That there wasn't anything innate about language learning. It was just simply that children were being rewarded for making the sounds similar to language, and so they made those sounds again, and over time they learned how to do, they were sort of shaped into making the sounds of mommy and daddy, and then so on and so forth. This seems to be a really difficult way to explain this phenomena, and as you might be able to guess, Skinner essentially lost this battle to another guy by the name of Noam Chomsky. Now, Noam Chomsky is a linguist, and he argues that we have a genetic predisposition to learn language. And some of the basis for this argument is that, children acquire language faster than, they could theoretically learn it using operant conditioning principles. He argues that people have a built-in sort of universal grammar. And there's also evidence, children understand grammatical rules without having to be taught them, right? So oftentimes kids will overgeneralize grammatical rules. For example, one goose is a goose, and for a young child, multiple geese are gooses, right? Because they've overgeneralized the grammatical rule that states when you have plural of some noun, you add an S to the end, right? If there's one car, there's one car. If there's many cars, it's cars. One dog, it's one dog. Many dogs, it's dogs, right? So the rule is to add an S. And what kids do is they often overgeneralize, right? And they're never going to be rewarded for overgeneralizing, yet they do this spontaneously, right? So this is kind of evidence against Skinner's perspective that language is the result of basically operant conditioning, rewards, and shaping. Right? Additionally, there seems to be a critical time period for language learning to take place, right? This is between 0 and about 5 years old, right? I mentioned earlier, if you take a child and you raise them in a bilingual household where they're hearing both Spanish and English, they will learn both of those languages. If you put them in a trilingual household where they're getting a steady flow of Spanish, French, and English, they will learn all three of those languages, right? But only if it occurs during this critical time period. If you can imagine children who have not learned language by the age of 6 or 7, it's very difficult for them to catch up. They do catch up, but it's difficult. So imagine a child who's never heard the sounds of adult language, and this is kind of hard to talk about. Unfortunately, this does happen. So there's a link here to a story about this little girl who was severely abused. She was locked in her bedroom for 10 years, basically left in complete isolation with, relative basic needs met. Like they fed her and they took out the bucket of, toilet from her room, but otherwise was just sort of tied to a chair and left in her room for 10 years. And this child, when she was born, this child, when she was discovered and rescued from this horrible situation, had very little language capabilities. She has since recovered, but not completely, right? So there's more to this developmental delay than just language. But the point here is that there's this critical time period, and if you don't get that language during this critical time period, it becomes more difficult in the future. Similar, children who are raised by wolves, there are examples of children raised in isolation who don't develop language, right? So the conclusion here then is that we do have this innate ability to learn language, but our biological predisposition to language doesn't mean we're going to do it by ourselves. We still need a social context, right? So if you're in isolation, you won't really develop a language. If you are isolated with a group of other people who are isolated, then you will develop a brand new, your own language, a la the Nicaraguan deaf kids. And if you're, not isolated and in with a group of people, you will learn the language that you are born into, or multiple languages if that's the case. So it's clear that it's both about predispositions and learning combined. And the idea here is that, genetics give us the hardware, the predisposition, and then our environment gives us the software that we need to learn language. So for example, parents do teach children language by repeating the incorrect sentence back to them with corrections, right? If you've ever had a child or known someone with a child, this is a common thing that we do. So if a child says something to you that's grammatically incorrect, then you repeat it back to them, but correct the sentence, right? So this is one way that we language is based on this social context. Okay, that was language in under 20 minutes. So in fact, I'm going to stop this here and we'll pick up with intelligence in the next video. Or maybe not. Maybe I'll just keep it going. I'll keep it going. That's the first time I'm doing this. All right. So intelligence is a pretty controversial domain in psychology because it's kind of hard to measure intelligence, right? All college undergraduates have to take the SAT or the ACT, and if you go to graduate school, you have to take the GRE or the LSAT. But there are pretty consistent group differences in performance on these intelligence tests that raise some critical questions about our definitions of intelligence and our measurement of intelligence. Right, so men tend to do better than women on intelligence tests. Whites tend to do better than ethnic minorities on these intelligence tests. The question is, what causes these differences, and what do these differences mean in terms of group-based intelligence? Is it the case that whites are just smarter than ethnic minorities, or is it the case that perhaps these tests are culturally biased? So just a brief history on intelligence testing. Started back in the early 1900s. Alfred Binet was trying to create the first intelligence to predict school performance of kids, was the first to sort of develop this idea of intelligence as a noun, talked about mental age, which is sort of your age relative to your ability, right? So if you are a typical 8-year-old, you'd have a mental age of 8, although if you're, a gifted child, perhaps you'd be 8 years old but have a mental age of 9. Alfred Binet worked with another researcher named Terman at Stanford, and they put together the Stanford-Binet intelligence test. And this was sort of the origins of our measurement and understanding of the idea of what is intelligence. Today we measure intelligence with the Wechsler as one of the most popular. Typically, IQ, intelligence quotient, is structured so that 100 is the average score at any given age. And what this means is that IQ tests, IQ is sort of a standardized. And so what this means is that intelligence is kind of a relative thing. It's relative to your culture. It's relative to what is important in your culture. And so, IQ is sort of standardized so that people are comparing how they do on these tests with other people. And so once you've got this standardized format, scores in this intelligence test are then compared to this standardization group. Now, scores on an IQ test are designed to follow a normal curve. And what this means is that most people score near the average, and fewer people in society fall near the extremes. So if you imagine that the average score of an intelligence test is 100, then most people's intelligence on these tests falls between scores of 84 and 116, with less and less people as you get further away. So about 95% of people score between 70 and 130, right? This is most of the population, right? Less than 5% of people score below 68 or above 132, right? Very small amount. Okay. So at this point, in my face-to-face classes, I would say, let's take an intelligence test. You've got 2 minutes to complete the test. You have to try to connect each of the points using only 4 lines and without picking up your pencil. Right? So you want to draw a line through these dots to connect them. You may not pick up your pencil, and for every time you draw a line, you may not pick up your pencil. Oh no, wait, I'm just saying, sorry. You may not pick up your pencil. You can only do it 4 straight lines. Try and connect all these dots, right? So at this point, I would say, try and do this. So just take a minute, try and do that. And I'm going to assume that you've paused me and taken a minute and tried to do that and found that it was really difficult. So I'll show you the solution now. So the solution is here. Then you go all the way out to here, back here, and lo and behold, you've connected all of these dots with just 4 lines without picking up your pencil. Okay. Now, what made that an intelligence test? Well, I said it was. Right? Does that make it an intelligence test? No. Right? What is it a test of? Maybe it's spatial ability. Maybe it's sort of your ability to think outside of the box. But it highlights this idea that what is intelligence is kind of hard to define. And oftentimes, intelligence ends up being what intelligence tests measure. Right? Experts pretty remarkably disagree on definitions of intelligence, right? So generally, it's the ability to learn from experience, solve problems, but how do you operationalize that? How do you, is being able to read a paragraph and answer questions about that, is that intelligence? So this sort of idea here is that intelligence is what intelligence tests measure. It's what people who create intelligence tests have decided that intelligence is. Right? So there's two important issues when we're making these kinds of tests, the reliability and validity. This is true for intelligence tests, but also true for any measurement. So reliability is the extent to which an intelligence test yields consistent results. So if I gave it to you, I gave it to you today, and then had you come back a year from now, your score, and take it again, your score should be relatively similar, right? If intelligence is this fixed thing that doesn't change very much, then it should be relatively similar. Now the test would be reliable if that was the case. Validity is the extent to which the test measures or predicts what it is supposed to, right? The extent to which it actually measures intelligence, whatever that is, right? So an intelligence test can be reliable but not valid. So for example, if I measure your intelligence every time and it tells you that you score 30 on this intelligence test, that would be reliable. It's telling you every time. Likewise, if I step on a scale and it tells me I weigh 30 pounds every time I step on it, that is a reliable scale. But is it a valid scale? Is it actually measuring your intelligence? Is this bathroom scale actually measuring my weight? Right? Obviously not. Right? You guys haven't really seen me very much, but I clearly don't weigh 30 pounds. Right? It's a reliable because it's giving me the same consistent result every time, but it's not valid. Right? So our IQ test that I gave you had low validity. Like it might be reliable, right? It might be reliable. You might answer the same, you might respond, people might respond similar to this test before they know how to do it, but it's not valid, right? It's not valid, right? It doesn't necessarily measure intelligence. So for IQ tests in general, test-free test reliability tends to be pretty high. So intelligence tests tend to be pretty reliable, but their validity, it's kind of questionable. So the correlation between the SAT and the GRE, pretty good. Correlation between IQ score and school performance is pretty good, 0.6. Correlation for adults between SAT and the first year of college is about 0.5. GRE and graduate school performance is about 0.3, right? And as we know about correlations, the lower they get, the less, the weaker the relationship is. So the strongest relationship is a correlation of 1.0. The weakest, almost no relationship at all, is 0.00. Right? So you can see that, there's a lot of variability in the validity of these intelligence tests. Or in other words, these intelligence tests only do sort of a mediocre job of predicting things that they should predict, right? The GRE should predict graduate school performance, but only about 15% of the variability in graduate school performance can be explained by how well you do on the GRE, which is not a whole lot. Now, cause of intelligence, the research suggests that there is sort of this mixture. There certainly is a genetic component to intelligence. So there certainly is nature, but there is but there's also nurture, environment, especially from the uterus through the early years. Homes with rich intellectual environments, supportive, responsive parents. These tend to be the best homes for developing intelligence. Although the relative importance of each of these is a pretty big debate, especially because of these group differences. So there are real racial differences in performances on IQ tests. And the question is this genetics, the environment, or cultural bias in the test questions? Right? So if you look at these averages, African Americans and Hispanic Americans tend to score on average lower on intelligence tests, IQ tests, than European Americans and Asian Americans. Now the question is, why do these differences exist? Is it a difference in genetics? Right? Probably not. Most people, and I say most people, but there are people in the world, sadly to say, who still believe this, but most people do not believe that whites are genetically superior to blacks and Latinos. Right? People do, but that's racism. And if you look at it on a genetic level, on a genetic level, whites and blacks and Latinos are vastly more similar than they are different genetically. So genetics really isn't a good explanation for these differences. But what about the environments, right? Well, there are group issues, there are group differences in the environments in which kids grow up. So in the United States, a greater proportion of Hispanic and African American families are economically disadvantaged compared to whites. And remember how we discussed this idea that preschool affects the effects of preschool on academic later life success. Wealthier children are more likely to have enriched environments, but kids who grow up in economically disadvantaged environments are less likely to have these enriched environments unless they go to preschool, unless they're getting it outside of the home. Now, there are some people, there are certainly some people who live in these disadvantaged conditions who do provide these enriched environments, but on the whole, on average, across the groups, they tend to be less enriched compared to those who are poor or disadvantaged tend to be have less intellectually enriched environments compared to those who are wealthy, right? But what's interesting about this is that even when we statistically control for SES, right, so we remove any effects of income and social disadvantage, we still see these group-based differences. Right? So even when we control for these economic disadvantages that are real, that do lead to, that can explain some of these group-based differences in intelligence scores, right? There are also cultural biases in these test questions. So for example, this is an actual item from the SAT, this analogy item. So runner is to marathon as, envoy is to embassy, martyr is to massacre, oarsman is to regatta, referee is to tournament, horse is to stable. What's the answer? The answer is C. Now, in order to get this answer correct, you need to know what oarsmen are and what regattas are, right? Do you think that this might be a biased test question, right? Regatta might be a word that would only be familiar to wealthy white people. Like I'm sure Mitt Romney's kids know very well what the word regatta means, right? If you don't know what it means, it's a sailboat race, right? Or a boat race, right? So the point here, though, is that this is culturally specific information, right? And what this suggests is that the performance on intelligence tests is lower for ethnic minorities in this country because the questions are biased towards the dominant culture. They are biased towards the white, male, wealthy, normative culture. So the current belief is not that ethnic minorities are quote unquote less intelligent, right? It's just that these tests are biased against people from those diverse cultural backgrounds. All right, so it's this current belief isn't that ethnic minorities have lower intelligence or a lower capacity for intelligence, right? Racism, some people still believe that, but in science, that's not the belief. The belief is, or the idea is, that it's just that there are cultural biases in these test questions, and that what is intelligence what defines intelligence is inherently culturally based. So, for example, in this video, which you can take a look at, it demonstrates that there are certain intellectual skill sets where Aboriginals, who are essentially the socially disadvantaged group in Australia, Aboriginals are far superior to Australian whites. And these are skills that are important to their culture. But those aspects of intelligence aren't measured on the IQ test because Australian whites are the dominant culture and they're the ones who create the tests, right? So the point is that these racial differences in performance are caused by cultural bias in the tests. One goal of IQ test developers is to be culturally fair, to try and eliminate any cultural influences, right? So eliminate the question where you have to know what a regatta is. However, these problems still persist, right? So that's it for language and intelligence. Hopefully that prepares you for this week's assignment, and hopefully this video worked. And if this works, I'm just going to do it just like this for the rest of the semester. All right, thanks, and see you next week.